Welcome to Crime Time, Inc. My name is Alex, and I'm your host today.
In a scene described by one investigator as reminiscent of a weird religious rite, 5 persons, including actress Sharon Tate, were found dead at the home of Miss Tate and her husband, screen director Roman Polanski. Miss Tate, who starred in Valley of the Dolls, was 8 months pregnant and was found in a bikini-type nightgown with a rope around her neck attached to the body of a man. Among the other victims were Hollywood hairstylist Jay Sebring and coffee heiress Abigail Folger. Authorities would allow no one in an unofficial capacity inside the posh $200,000 home in the hills overlooking Los Angeles. When police arrived, they found the telephones and electricity lines cut. The bodies had been dead about 12 hours. They were discovered this morning by a maid who ran screaming to neighbors. One officer summed up the murders when he said, "In all my years, I have never seen anything like this before."
Like the last episode, this episode contains explicit and detailed descriptions of extreme violence. The content includes graphic accounts of homicide, assault, and other disturbing criminal acts. This material is presented for historical accuracy and educational purposes only, not for sensationalism. These descriptions may be extremely upsetting and potentially triggering for many listeners. Listener discretion is strongly advised. If you are sensitive to accounts of violence or are listening in the presence of children or others who may be adversely affected, we recommend skipping these episodes, or I will warn you by saying graphic content warning prior to the description of the crimes. The historical significance of these crimes and their impact on American culture necessitates a complete accounting of events. But we understand if listeners need to engage with this material at their own pace or avoid certain sections entirely. The content you are about to hear is taken from testimony, statements, and interviews of the perpetrators of the crimes and witnesses and have been checked and cross-referenced for accuracy. Some testimonies vary slightly on some minor details. The first hint that something was amiss at Cielo Drive came before dawn on August 9, 1969. A few minutes before 5 a.m., the Los Angeles Times delivery boy pushed a newspaper into the mailbox outside the gate. As he did so, he noticed something unusual: a cut wire dangling down from the telephone pole. It was a small detail that would later take on grave significance. Around 7:30 a.m., Seymour Cott, the closest neighbor down the hill, also saw the cut wire while retrieving his morning paper. But like the paper boy, he didn't think much of it. It wasn't until shortly after 8 a.m. that the true horror began to unfold. Winifred Chapman, the housekeeper for the Cielo Drive residence, arrived for work as usual. She, too, noticed the dangling wire and briefly worried it might be a downed power line. However, when she pressed the button outside the fence, the gate opened normally, suggesting the electricity was still working. Chapman walked up the driveway, passing a white Rambler automobile without looking inside. This wasn't unusual. Her employers often had overnight guests who sometimes parked haphazardly on the property. Instead of walking around to the main entrance past the lawn, Chapman entered through a servant's entrance at the back of the house. Immediately, she noticed something was wrong. The steamer trunks were in a different place than usual, and then she saw blood. First just smears on the trunks, then pools of it seemingly everywhere. Chapman looked into the living room, peering over the top of the couch. The front door was open, and through it she could see a body lying on the lawn. Terrified, she fled down the driveway. As she ran past the white Rambler, she glanced inside and saw another body. Neighbors heard her screaming, "Murder, death, bodies, blood," and quickly called the police. At 9:14 a.m., 2 one-man patrol car units responded to a Code 2 possible homicide call. One of the responding officers was Jerry Joe DeRosa. A neighbor provided Officer DeRosa with information about who he believed lived at the Hilltop house: movie director Roman Polanski and his wife, 2 of their friends, the property owner Rudy Altobelli, who was away on a trip, and a young man named William Garrettson, who was acting as caretaker. The neighbor mentioned that Mrs. Polanski was an actress named Sharon Tate. Chapman showed DeRosa how to open the front gate. DeRosa saw the body in the Rambler, but waited to proceed further until his fellow officer, William Wiesenhunt, joined him. With weapons at the ready, DeRosa carrying a rifle and Wisenhunt armed with a shotgun, they cautiously approached the house. As they inspected the other cars on the property, a third officer, Robert Burbridge, arrived. The three policemen crossed to the lawn where they discovered two more bodies. They noticed a window screen had been slit, apparently how the killer or killers had entered the house. But they also observed another cracked window without a screen, one that opened into the nursery. The officers raised that window and climbed inside. In what appeared to be the living room, they found two more butchered bodies, a man and a woman. These victims were tethered by nooses around their necks, with 3-ply white nylon rope connecting them, looped over a beam in the ceiling. Massive puddles of blood and smears of gore were everywhere. The officers found no other bodies in the main house, but remembering the neighbor's mention of a guest house and caretaker, they proceeded to check the cottage on the property. As they approached the door of the cottage, they heard a dog bark and a male voice hissing, "Shh, be quiet!" The officers kicked in the door and Altabelli's Weimaraner dog attacked. Officer Wisenhunt slammed the door on the dog's head to trap it, while the young man inside called the animal off. This was 19-year-old William Garrettson, who appeared incoherent to the officers, possibly from drugs. The police hauled Garrettson outside and marched him past the bodies on the lawn. The young caretaker was so disoriented that he misidentified the victims, claiming Abigail Folger was housekeeper Winifred Chapman and that Wojtek Frykowski was Roman Polanski's younger brother. Garrettson swore to the officers that he'd been closed up in the guest cottage all night and hadn't seen or heard anything. The police were skeptical. The guest cottage wasn't that far from the main house, maybe 100 feet at most. How could he not have heard something during such a brutal attack? Officer DeRosa read Garrettson his rights and arrested him for murder. As DeRosa escorted him down the driveway past the Rambler, Garrettson claimed he didn't recognize the body inside. When they reached the closed gate, DeRosa pushed the button with his finger, unknowingly wiping away a bloody fingerprint carelessly left there by Tex Watson just hours earlier, a crucial piece of evidence destroyed. DeRosa then called in to report 5 homicides and a suspect in custody at the Cielo address. Print reporters and TV crews in Los Angeles routinely monitored police band radio, and the announcement of a mass murder spurred them into immediate action. Within minutes, members of the media began arriving at the scene. Eventually, so many gathered that their cars and mobile production trucks lined the narrow road all the way to the bottom of the steep hill. While the media clamored for information, more officers and LAPD investigative personnel streamed through the gate and into the house. They discovered various items of possible evidence: eyeglasses, scattered fingerprints, and 3 pieces of a broken gun grip. There were bloody footprints throughout the house, though some had been tracked in by the police themselves. Forensic chemist Joe Granado took 45 blood samples from various drying pools, but missed many more. At noon, William Tennant, Polanski's agent, arrived and identified everyone except the body in the Rambler. A police sergeant finally made a statement to the media gathered just outside the gate. "It's like a battlefield up there." The families of the 4 identified victims were notified, but Steve Parent's mother and father were left to spend the day wondering why their always reliable son hadn't come home the night before or even bothered to call. Amid the hubbub at the main house, no one thought to check the license plates on the Rambler that would have identified the 5th victim. The first wire bulletins flashed across the country. 5 slain in Bel Air. Homicide detectives were assigned to the case, with the first arriving in the early afternoon. Sergeant Michael McGann noticed something the patrol officers had missed: the word "pig" scrawled in blood on the lower panel of the front door. The bodies had been left in place for the detectives to examine. McGann had been working homicide for 5 years, but his initial reaction was, "This is the worst." Detective Danny Galindo was placed in charge of the evidence, preserving each item. Investigators found marijuana in Jay Sebring's car, along with a gram of cocaine. A sex manual written in Chinese turned up in one of the bedrooms. A reel of film discovered in the attic showed Polanski and Tate having sex when viewed back at the station. It was discreetly returned to Polanski later. Susan Atkins's lost buck knife was found under a sofa cushion, though at this point the police had no idea who it belonged to or its significance to the case. But of most immediate interest to investigators was what Galindo later described as a goodly amount of narcotics out in the open throughout the house. About 7 grams of marijuana were found in a plastic baggie in a living room cabinet. 30 grams of hashish were on the guest bedroom nightstand, along with 10 capsules of the psychedelic drug MDA. Investigators found marijuana residue in an ashtray by Tate's bed, a joint on a desk by the front door, and 2 more in the guest house. Even by the standards of the late 1960s, it was a substantial amount of drugs. If the teenage caretaker didn't turn out to be the killer, McGann thought the carnage could very likely have resulted from some drug connection gone wrong. But Gerritsen remained the prime suspect. McGann's regular partner was on vacation, so Sergeant Jess Buckles was assigned to work with him on the case. Lieutenant Robert Helder, LAPD's supervisor of investigations, was placed in overall command. They were a very senior group. The murder of a movie star was going to generate significant media attention, and LAPD Chief Ed Davis wanted the case brought to a swift and satisfactory conclusion. Leaks to the media were inevitable. By early afternoon, newscasts revealed 4 victims' identities. The public learned that Wojtek Frykowski, Abigail Folger, and Jay Sebring were dead. Under almost any other circumstances, TV, radio, and print coverage of the murders would have focused on the slayings of a coffee fortune heiress and the most famous hairdresser in America, with Frykowski receiving only a brief mention. But from the first announcement, media attention focused on the bloody demise of a movie star. In death, Sharon Tate instantly attained star status. From the afternoon of August 9th onward, the slaughter at Cielo Drive would simply be known as the Tate Murders. Charles Manson had slept late that morning, missing the first television bulletins about the murders. But many other family members had gathered around the TV, watching with intense interest as news of the killings broke. Susan Atkins, in particular, displayed an unsettling glee at being part of something so newsworthy. This wasn't some official family meeting with a formal announcement about what had happened the night before. Instead, the atmosphere at the ranch was charged with the prideful, partial boasts from Susan and Tex Watson, who clearly wanted their peers to know they'd been specially selected to carry out what they considered a critical task for Charlie. And that they had delivered. The details circulating among the family were garbled, though. All most of them knew for certain was that 5 people had died. In their initial adrenaline rush of having made headlines, of having done something so spectacularly gruesome that it dominated television coverage, the family members seemed almost excited as TV commentators speculated about who could have committed such an awful thing and why. What's particularly telling about this moment is what the family failed to notice. None of the newscasts mentioned possible Black Panther involvement or any connection between these slayings and the earlier murder of Gary Hinman. The news stories focused solely on the horrific murder of an actress and others. Charlie's elaborate plan to ignite a race war through carefully planted clues was already failing. The media narrative was taking a completely different direction than what he had intended. This disconnect between Manson's expectations and reality would become increasingly significant as the investigation continued. But on that Saturday at Spahn Ranch, the family remained in their own bubble of dark achievement, congratulating themselves on what they believed was just the beginning of HelterSkelter. More to come after this quick break. Police had an immediately connected parent to the body found in the Rambler. It was an enterprising reporter who noted the car's license plate and traced it to Wilfred and Juanita Parent in El Monte. Only later did LAPD conduct their own check, leading to the heartbreaking moment when Wilfred Parent was asked to call the county coroner's office to identify his son's body. As night fell on the crime scene, Detective Danny Galindo was ordered to stand guard. The house completely unnerved him. Trying to rest, he found it impossible. Blood coated nearly every surface, even splattered across the walls. Finally, he retreated to a back room and dozed fitfully. Meanwhile, Charles Manson had awakened in time to catch the evening news broadcasts. He immediately recognized what his followers had missed. There was no mention of the Black Panthers or Gary Hinman's earlier murder. Despite the slaughter of famous people, the reaction Manson needed hadn't materialized. Bobby Beausoleil remained imprisoned, and there were no stirrings of the race war Manson called HelterSkelter. That evening, Manson initially went along with the celebratory mood at Spahn Ranch, encouraging everyone to smoke marijuana while he played guitar. But after sending most family members to bed, he gathered a select group: Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Linda Kasabian, and 2 new additions, Steve Clem Grogan and Leslie Van Houten. Last night was handled badly, Manson told them coldly. There was too much panic at the house. They would go out again tonight and do it right. To ensure no mistakes this time, Manson himself would accompany them and demonstrate how it should be done. As they changed into dark clothes, Patricia Krenwinkel would later confess what separated this night from the previous one. The first night, we didn't know. The second night, we did. More people were about to die. The oppressive Los Angeles heat finally broke on Saturday evening. After temperatures above 90 degrees, the city cooled to the 70s, with soft breezes and light fog creating a pleasant night for driving. Seven family members, Charlie, Tex, Clem, Linda, Susan, Pat, and Leslie, crammed uncomfortably into Johnny Schwartz's Ford. Charlie planned at least 2 separate slaughters. Doubling the murder scenes would make police more likely to buy into his copycat scheme and tie everything to the Hinman killing. Charlie had no intention of committing the murders himself. Clem would follow orders without question, while Leslie was smart enough to leave the right bloody words and Black Panther clues without leaving fingerprints. Charlie gave Tex a new handgun and military bayonet. Linda drove with Charlie beside her, barking orders and berating her when she missed turns. Everyone had smoked marijuana that day, with Tex and Susan also using methamphetamine. They meandered through residential streets for what seemed like forever, stopping occasionally for Charlie to reconnoiter potential targets. Meanwhile, Leno and Rosemary LaBianca had just returned home from Lake Isabella. They were upper middle class. Leno ran a chain of grocery stores. Rosemary co-owned a boutique. They'd worked hard for their success, especially Rosemary, who had risen from an orphanage to business ownership and stock market success. Leno was a chronic gambler whose other hobby was collecting rare coins. They seemed to have no enemies. The LaBiancas had missed initial news reports about the Tate murders, as they'd been at Lake Isabella, where Rosemary's son Frank was staying an extra night. They dropped off Rosemary's daughter Suzanne at her apartment around 1 a.m. Sunday, then stopped at John Fokianos' all-night newsstand to buy a paper. Being sociable people, they chatted with Fokianos about the big news, the Tate murders, before heading home. Somewhere in Pasadena, Charlie and Tex got out of the car and walked up to a house and peered in the windows. In the living room, bathed in warm light, they could see framed photographs of children arranged neatly on one wall. Charlie shook his head, and when they were back at the car, he told the others he didn't want to kill children. Not yet. But the time might come, he warned, when they'd have to kill the children as well. A few minutes later, another house, a mansion on top of a hill, was rejected because the neighboring homes were too close to it. Charlie said that someone might hear screams. They stopped at a church, and Charlie got out, saying he was going to kill the priest. He returned after a few moments and told them everything was locked up and no one had answered the rectory bell. In another residential neighborhood, they saw a couple pulling into their driveway. They stopped across the street, but after waiting for a few minutes, Charlie changed his mind and they headed out to the beach. An hour later, coming toward town on Sunset Boulevard, they passed a small white sports car. Linda was driving at this point, and Charlie told her to pull up beside the car at the next signal. He was going to kill the driver. She did what she was told and he jumped out, the gun in his hand. But just then the light turned green and the sports car took off. The driver never aware how close he had come to death. Graphic content warning. Charlie directed Linda to Los Feliz, specifically Waverly Drive. Tex, Susan, and Pat recognized the street. They'd partied at Harold True's house there before he moved away months earlier. Charlie ordered Linda to park below Harold's former house. He walked up the driveway of the neighboring home, returned shortly, and took Tex with him back to the house. Peering through a window, Tex saw a man apparently asleep on the couch with a newspaper over his face. Using the unlocked back door, they entered. A big dog nosed at them with friendly curiosity as they crossed through the kitchen into the living room. Charlie poked the man gently with the pistol to wake him up. Grocery store owner Leno LaBianca's first words were, "Who are you? What do you want?" Holding the gun on him, Charlie smiled and murmured, "We're not going to hurt you. Just relax. Don't be afraid." "How can I help being afraid when you've got a gun on me?" LaBianca asked with unintentional irony. Charlie's voice remained low, soothing. "It's okay. I'm your friend. We don't want anything but money." Telling the heavyset man to roll over onto his stomach, Charlie pulled off a leather thong that had been looped around his neck and told Tex to tie LaBianca's hands with it. The man immediately protested that it was too tight, especially when they turned him onto his back again, with the weight of his body pressing down on his wrists. Charlie asked if there was anyone else in the house. "Yes," LaBianca answered. "His wife was in the bedroom." Charlie disappeared for a minute or two and then returned with Rosemary LaBianca, holding the gun on her, but still murmuring assurances that no one was going to be hurt. This was just a simple robbery. He sat the frightened-looking woman at her husband's feet. She had on pajamas, but had pulled the blue dress she was now wearing over her pink nightgown after Charlie had suddenly appeared in her bedroom. She was terrified but cooperative. Charlie instructed her to sit beside her husband. Mr. LaBianca was still complaining that his hands were bound too tightly, and Mrs. LaBianca turned to Charlie and said, "You're hurting my husband, the way he's sitting. Can't you get him in a more comfortable position?" But LaBianca stayed as he was. He said to Charlie with an attempt at reason, "Look, we'll give you anything you want. Just tell us." Charlie, still speaking with almost hypnotic calm, answered, "Do you have any cash?" LaBianca told him that the only cash in the house was what he'd left on his nightstand next to the bed, and perhaps a little in his wife's wallet. Charlie sent Tex for both and was obviously displeased at how little money there was. "I can get you more," LaBianca insisted nervously. "Just let me take you to my store and you can get as much as you want." "No," Charlie answered. "We just want what's here." Then he decided to separate them again. They took Mrs. LaBianca back to the bedroom and stripped off the pillowcases. Following Charlie's instructions to gag them, Tex went into the living room, put a pillowcase over Leno LaBianca's head, and tied a lamp cord around his skull and through his mouth as tightly as he could. Then he went back into the bedroom and did the same with Mrs. LaBianca, telling her not to make a sound because they would be right in the next room. After taking Rosemary's wallet, Charlie left to get Pat and Leslie from the car. He ordered them to move Rosemary back to the bedroom, snapped at Tex to make sure everybody does something, then departed with Linda, Clem, and Susan. Pat gathered knives from the kitchen while Leslie stood by reluctantly. Pat later recalled being afraid not for the LaBiancas, but for herself, believing Charlie would beat or kill her if she disobeyed. As she gripped the door frame, she silently begged God to make it stop. But when nothing happened, she never believed in God since. When Leno began struggling and screaming, Tex repeatedly stabbed him in the throat with the bayonet. Leno gurgled, "I'm dead, I'm dead," until he finally lay still. Hearing this, Rosemary screamed, "What are you doing to my husband?" and struggled to break free, dragging a heavy lamp behind her. Pat stabbed her repeatedly before Tex finished her off with the bayonet as Leslie retreated to the hall. When Pat reported Leno was still alive, Tex stabbed him again. Either Tex or Pat carved war on Leno's exposed abdomen. Pat jammed a carving fork into his belly and thrust a small kitchen knife into his throat. Charlie wanted a spectacular crime scene. They then turned to Rosemary's corpse, yanking up her dress and nightgown as Leslie repeatedly stabbed her buttocks and legs, showing little enthusiasm but participating as ordered. The killers grabbed Leno's coin collection, wiped away fingerprints, and wrote "Rise" and "Death to Pigs" in blood on the walls. Pat added "HelterSkelter" to the refrigerator door, misspelling "Helter." Before leaving, they helped themselves to watermelon and chocolate milk, leaving the rinds in the sink. Tex had a shower before they left. After driving away, Charlie gave Rosemary's wallet to Linda, telling her to remove any money and wipe it clean of fingerprints. He planned to dispose of it in a black neighborhood to frame someone else for the murders. They stopped at a gas station where Linda dropped the wallet in the women's toilet tank, while Charlie bought milkshakes at a nearby Denny's. Charlie then relaxed, letting Linda drive to the beach where all four walked along the sand. Charlie was delighted when Linda told him she was pregnant. When police officers questioned them, Charlie calmly explained they were just taking a walk. As Tex, Pat, and Leslie walked in the pre-dawn darkness, they came across a reservoir, and Tex threw the bayonet out as far as he could into the water. Finally, half an hour later, they settled down under a tree in a vacant lot, waiting for dawn. Once the sky started to lighten, they began walking again. Tex was still carrying his bloody clothes, and when they found a large cardboard box full of trash, he pushed them down under the grass and garbage. Shortly afterward, they met a man coming out for his morning paper and got directions to the Golden State Freeway. Back at the beach, Charlie directed Linda to Venice, asking if she knew anyone there. Linda remembered Saladin Nader, an actor she'd met while panhandling. Charlie handed her a knife and ordered her to slit the man's throat. When Linda refused, "I'm not you, Charlie," he instructed her, Clem, and Susan to commit the murder while he returned to Spahn Ranch. But after Charlie left, Linda deliberately led Clem and Susan to the wrong apartment. When a stranger answered the door, they abandoned the plan, buried the gun on the beach, and hitchhiked back to the ranch. Tex, Pat, and Leslie had already arrived, having been lucky enough to get a ride from a man who had visited Spahn Ranch before and had a crush on Leslie. They treated him to breakfast on the way, paying with coins taken from the LaBiancas. When they reached the ranch, no one compared notes about what they had done. After such a long, exhausting night, everyone just wanted to sleep. On Sunday morning, August 10th, 1969, Los Angeles woke to horrifying headlines. The brutal Cielo Drive murders dominated front pages, now described as ritualistic slayings. The Los Angeles Times reported that "pig" was written in blood on the front door and that Sharon Tate had been wearing only undergarments when killed. Meanwhile, Charles Manson prowled anxiously around Spahn Ranch, interrogating his followers about fingerprints and bloody clothing. "Did you leave anything that might link the murders to me and the family?" They assured him they hadn't. Time for a quick break. At the Hall of Justice that same morning, County Coroner Thomas Noguchi began the painstaking autopsies of the 5 victims. The results were gruesome. Sharon Tate had 16 stab wounds, 5 potentially fatal. Jay Sebring was shot once and stabbed 7 times. Abigail Folger suffered 28 stab wounds. Wojtek Frykowski, who fought hardest, was shot twice, stabbed 51 times, and struck with a blunt object 13 times. Steve Parent had been shot 4 times. All bullets were .22 caliber, fired from the same gun. While the autopsies were in progress, Sergeants Paul Whiteley and Charles Genther, 2 homicide detectives from the Los Angeles Sheriff's Office, approached Sergeant Jess Buckles, one of the Los Angeles Police Department detectives assigned to the Tate homicides, and told him something very curious. On July 31st, they had gone to 964 Old Topanga Road in Malibu to investigate a report of a possible homicide. They had found the body of Gary Hinman, a 34-year-old music teacher. He had been stabbed to death. The strange thing, as in the Tate homicides, a message had been left at the scene. On the wall in the living room, not far from Hinman's body, were the words "political piggy" printed in the victim's own blood. Whiteley also told Buckles that they had arrested a suspect in connection with the murder, a young hippie musician. They had arrested him on August 6, therefore he had been in custody at the time of the Tate homicides. However, it was possible that he hadn't been the only one involved in the Hinman murder. The suspect had been living at Spawn's Ranch, an old movie ranch near the Los Angeles suburb of Chatsworth, with a bunch of other hippies. It was an odd group, their leader, a guy named Charlie, apparently having convinced them that he was Jesus Christ. Buckles, Whiteley would later recall, lost interest when he mentioned hippies. "No," he replied, "we know what's behind these murders. They're part of a big dope transaction." Whiteley again emphasized the odd similarities, like mode of death. In both cases, a message had been left, both printed, both in a victim's blood, and in both the letters pig appeared. Any one of these things would be highly unusual, but all of them, the odds against its being a coincidence must be astronomical. Sergeant Buckles told Sergeants Whiteley and Ginther, "If you don't hear from us in a week or so, that means we're on to something else." So, a little more than 24 hours after the discovery of the Tate victims, the Los Angeles Police Department was given a lead by the Los Angeles Sheriff's Office, which, if followed, could possibly have broken the case. Buckles never did call, nor did he think the information important enough to walk across the autopsy room and mention the conversation to his superior, Lieutenant Robert Helder, who was in charge of the Tate investigation. By Sunday evening, tragedy struck again. Frank Struthers returned to his home on Waverly Drive to find his stepfather's boat oddly parked outside and all window shades pulled down. With his sister Suzanne and her boyfriend Joe, they entered the house and discovered the bodies of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca, horrifically stabbed. The crime scene bore disturbing similarities to Cielo Drive, words written in blood, including "Death to Pigs," "Rise," and "HelterSkelter" on the refrigerator door. Detective Danny Galindo, still typing reports about the Tate murders, was immediately dispatched to the LaBianca scene. When reporters asked if the cases were connected, he speculated it was more of a copycat case. The LAPD quickly developed a theory that Leno's gambling debts, possibly to the mafia, provided a motive. From the beginning, the two investigative teams, the older, experienced Tate detectives and the younger, tech-oriented LaBianca team, failed to effectively share information. Fear gripped Los Angeles. In Beverly Hills, handgun sales skyrocketed from a few per day to 200 in just 48 hours. Guard dog prices jumped from $200 to $1,500. While the wealthy were terrified by the Tate murders, the LaBianca killings struck deeper fear among average citizens. If small business owners could be slaughtered in their homes, nobody was safe. Manson had wanted the murders to incite citywide panic with racial undertones, but his plan failed spectacularly. Not one news article mentioned Black Panthers as potential perpetrators, despite the blood writing and mimicked paw print at Gary Hinman's murder scene. Charlie had fundamentally misunderstood Los Angeles' geography. Unlike other major cities where races mixed daily, LA's sprawl kept communities isolated. Most white residents in Bel Air or Los Feliz had likely never seen a Black Panther. Neither the LAPD nor media ever considered these murders racially motivated. Nevertheless, Manson brandished newspaper headlines to his followers, declaring, "It started." He urged them to prepare for immediate departure to Death Valley's Barker Ranch, warning that people would soon come for them at Spawn. And he was right. In the next episode, we'll have a close look at what I guess will be Simon and Tom's favorite part so far, the initial police investigation. But for now, let's hear from them and get their expert analysis after this quick break.
Alex, congratulations on episode 10. I was absolutely super. Simon, again, a fantastic piece of research, wonderful storytelling here, and as we suspect and as we feared, we're coming up against 1960s crime scene management, and it's a debacle.
And I recognise it fully from my days. I inherited that. A lot of the stuff you did as well. Tom, there's lots of training goes on. Nobody's really aware of the training that goes on with police officers from the minute they sign on the dotted line and become policemen. Passed down from their peers originally, their very basic training is a locus is a precious place to be, and they're not allowed in and all the rest of it. Right through your service, it's drummed into you. But it's incredible how many times police officers slipped up over the years, in my experience. And I know that wouldn't be unique to Strathclyde, because we're all policemen at the end of the day. But this was more than that, wasn't it? It was a complete lack of leadership and management.
Remember, over here we are one police service and we all have common training. And you're absolutely right. Ever since the 1930s, since the Ruxton case, we've all been trained in basic crime scene management and preservation. But in the United States, they have still, and they certainly had then back in the 1960s, many, many tiers of policing, some of whom were very poorly trained or with very little training at all, who literally have a uniform, a revolver with 5 bullets and a notepad. Any training is done very locally. So I think we've got to recognise that. But what struck me about this was the fact that quite often you see crime scenes botched because an officer first attending at the scene isn't quite sure whether it's a homicide or a natural death. And in this case, there was no doubt whatsoever from minute one that this was a homicide. It was a butcher's shop. And Alex's description and storytelling makes that clear. So there could have been no doubt that this was a scene of crime of some kind. And therefore, you'd have thought the first thing they'd have done, at least, is seal off the location. But of course they didn't. And before we know, long before specialists arrive, the place is getting trampled all over by all sorts of people. Media, TV, and all the rest of it. What was remarkable to me, it was hours before homicide detectives arrived.
And it goes on, doesn't it? What we're alluding to here, Tom, is that the first cops that arrive on the scene set the tone. They seal it off. That's what should happen. It's totally sealed off. And anyone that gets anywhere near it, you have to know who it is so that you can identify anything afterwards. The doctor pronouncing life, etc. In this case, the locus is widespread because it's a massive house that they're in, right up to the driveway and the car in the driveway and all the rest of it. And the basics have to be in place. And that's what was missing here, wasn't it?
Yeah, very much. It is a nightmarish thing. Remember, it's 1969, but even in the 1960s, faced with that scene, you'd have thought there would be an awareness, but there clearly wasn't. One consequence is that the media are running the story of the glamorous Sharon Tate being murdered in her negligee, shades of Marilyn Monroe, all that stuff, long before the actual police get on the scene and start to investigate and start to think about investigative procedures and investigative storylines. So the media have already run away with it, long before the detectives are actually on the scene.
We were remarking in the last episode about the control that Manson was exerting on his family, that they would go and do things at his behest. Now, we know because of the job that Alex has done over the last few months, that was all the culmination of months and months of programming, ripping of identification and drug control, all the things that Charlie's been doing. That first night was a valve letting loose with this extreme violence. Do you think the threshold comes down then, that on the second night it becomes more normal to do this? Because Manson wants them to make an impact. He wants them to make it the most gory scene that you can ever imagine. It'll have the bigger media impact that he's looking for, and ultimately to blame the black people for it and trigger this HelterSkelter that he's got in his head.
Yeah, I think that's true, Simon. I think there is a threshold which once you cross it, and once you realise you can do it. I've spoken to a number of people who have been in the military and in combat. They say that the first time you're in combat, you're absolutely terrified. But once that first time is over and you've survived and you are aware of your own capabilities and the capabilities of your mates and your weaponry and all the rest of it, then your confidence grows. I don't want to draw that kind of comparison, but there is that. But the other thing that struck me also, while the plan was clear, the HelterSkelter plan and the distraction from Bobby Beausoleil, the equipment was very poor. I don't know if you picked up, Alec talked about being armed with a bunt line. Now, Yeah, as you may know, I have a small interest in ballistics. And Ned Buntline was a man who in the 1860s, I think, started to patent and develop extremely long-barreled revolvers, which were called Buntline Specials. And the Buntline Special was supposed to be a lot more accurate than a normal pistol. I don't know if it was, but it certainly appeared to be. And a .22 Buntline is a target pistol.
No.
Very small caliber bullet with a very long barrel. Not the kind of weapon at all you would be using either for stopping power or for manoeuvrability. So I mean, when I heard that he'd been armed with a Buntline .22, I thought, this is amateur night in the movies. It really is. In the first murder, the Tex, he had to shoot the poor guy about 4 or 5 times before he killed him. What comes through, particularly with Tex, is this cold-bloodedness. If we go on to the LaBianca murder, it's completely random. These two people in their house, cold-hearted, and Tex even stays about the crime scene long enough to have a shower. It really is extraordinary behaviour, extraordinary lack of awareness, extraordinary lack of forensic awareness, completely cold-hearted.
Yeah.
And you just murder them. No connection. You don't know who they are. You don't know whether they've got any political views. You don't know what. Nothing. It's just a slaughter for no reason.
We were talking about amateur policemen turning up at the locus and why the delay in the CID getting there. I don't imagine when a photographer got there or when someone from the medics got there.
Totally. The whole thing was, I think the best example of that was where the pickup truck was lying at the crime scene with the dead body in it. Nobody thought to check the registration plate until a journalist did. I mean, that's taking incompetence to a new level.
The only thing I can say in any way to explain it is the enormity of it, Tom. There's nobody arrived at that scene that had ever seen anything like that before, and nobody has seen anything like that since because of the gratuitous violence. Normally, a policeman going to a house like that with film stars and producers would be in awe anyway. Going there in these circumstances with the kind of things they saw that most police officers would never encounter in their career, I can only give them that slight out, is that they were overwhelmed by the whole situation.
Yeah, you think they froze. That could be, Simon, that could well be, actually. But again, in Los Angeles, I would have thought that going to shootings and going to violent crime would have been fairly routine. But I do agree with you. I think probably what happened is they got to the scene.
Yes.
It's an overwhelming scene of violence. And before they get a chance to gather themselves, they've got the press round about them. They've got people coming up the driveway. They've got folk knocking at the door. So you're instantly distracted. And this is why you'll know as well as I do that when we're dealing with scenes of murder here, you protect your officers who are at the scene. You protect them from all that so that they do not get distracted.
And it's not just murder scenes where somebody, the investigating officer, it doesn't need to be a senior officer at that stage, will say, just get everybody away. You just need time to think. And the only way you can do that is to get the clutter out the way and the noise out the way and sit and start thinking rationally. It's interesting that you and I can see this from that perspective. I think in the next chat we have with Alex, we'll maybe get a wee bit more from him to comment, because he's obviously come across all the nuances of this during his investigation to come up with these episodes. We'll maybe have a wee chat with him next time and get it from his perspective.
From a researcher's perspective, I think that would be interesting to do, because undoubtedly, Alex, you've done a fantastic job of this. What a piece of research and what a storytelling ability you've got. You've brought it to life, warts and all.
All right, Tom, I look forward to that.
Take care, Simon.
You too.
See you soon.
Bye now.